I be on it. You know it.
She's always on the outskirts.
Okay. I'm not gonna write anything tonight.
What?
What? She's like, what? But because I want you guys to think, and if it helps you to write while you think, then great. We're gonna deal with a thing, and it's not necessarily a Hebrew term, but I'm gonna give it to you in Hebrew, and it's the difference between form and function. And it's a tool, and because we're dealing with Genesis, it's very important. It's going to be a tool that allows you to filter or remove your own natural, or I shouldn't even say natural, your indoctrinated biases from your mind, right? So I'll give it to you kind of in English. So form is how something presents itself visually or how it tastes, right? How you feel about it sometimes. Function is what it does and why it does that thing. Okay, so a popular example is a pencil. So if I ask you what's a pencil, what would you tell me?
A writing utensil.
All these people already know. Of course, it's something you write with, but naturally in our Western mind, we go, oh, a pencil. If I ask you to describe it, you say a pencil is yellow. It's a number 2. It has a piece of lead at the end and an eraser at this end. None of that matters Hebraically. All that matters to the Hebrew is what does this thing do? We have this thing that happens at home. We have, I don't know if everybody has this, we have a junk drawer. And it normally keeps change. Stuff that doesn't necessarily have a place at home. And you're just like, I just put it in this drawer, we'll figure it out later. And pins. And he has this thing when he grabs a pin out of the drawer, he goes to write with it, he immediately goes, this pin is useless. I'm like, what happened? It doesn't write. So while it is still a pen, and it may still have ink in it, and it may be pretty, and it might have all the bells and whistles, if it doesn't write, it's useless. That's how Yah views things. If it doesn't fit the function for us, then that thing is then useless to us. It may be useful for something else, right? Have you ever heard the passage? There's nothing unclean of itself. Anybody know? You want to give me that one? You have it? No, you don't have it on you. Okay, so I'm gonna find it. It means that for everything has a function. For instance, a pig is not unclean to a pig.
Yeah.
Right? A skunk is not unclean to a skunk. It has a function, and it's not unclean in its function. But when it's interjected into our space, and when we begin to consume them or do things, and it's dysfunctional, or it has no function for us. So, one of the things that happens when we first come into this walk, and we'll deal with this in Genesis, the first thing that the Most High puts in place is who's in control, right? Who established everything, what its function is. You don't get a description of what every animal looks like. He's not, and this animal was fuzzy, and this animal was strong. And no, he was like, animals from the earth do this. Animals from the water do this. Animals from the sky do this. Humans do this. You eat like this. And he's very much dealing with function, and he doesn't really tell you what everything looked like, right? He goes, the river came from here, and the river flowed this way, and it was dividing this, and it was doing. He didn't say, and it was pristine, and it was beautiful, it was sparkling, and it was like, no. And one of the interesting things that happens when the adversary tempts Chua with the tree of knowledge and good and evil is that he gets her with form and not function. He goes, look, it looks good. Doesn't it look good? Doesn't it look like it tastes good? And then she eats it because he switched her mind to form instead of function, because the function was, it's not for you.
Right. That was Romans 14:14.
Romans 14:14. And can you read it for me?
Yeah, it says, I know and am persuaded by Yahushua HaMashiach there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean.
Okay, Romans 14:14. So when we're dealing with this idea of form and function, it's established in Genesis. So anytime we deviate from function into form, we have to adjust back to function. For instance, all of us pretty much, has anybody here not ever eaten pork? No? You never had pork? Okay, so one person. So for the other people, and the babies, of course, for most people, probably now it might taste disgusting, but when you were eating it, Was it not, did it taste good? Right? That's form. That's not function. Form is, oh, it tastes good to me though. But function is, what is it doing to your body? And is it for you? Right? You can do that with anything. Right? So you can take literally anything. I won't go through it all thanks there's kids here. But there are things that feel good to us, and it's form. It's how it makes me feel. So when we're dealing with scripture, one of the things that I had to learn to do, especially when I got into restudying the New Testament after coming out of a westernized religious mindset, was I had to say, every time I come across something that makes me feel or does not fit the form that I've been taught, I have to first be wrong. So when I would read stuff and Paul was like, oh, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness' sake. Most people go, see, that's why I have to keep the law. My mind had to go to, is that form? Is that form or function? Is the law functional? I have to understand the function of the law before I can determine how it makes me feel about it. Because once you remove how you feel about it and you operate in the function of something, then you are pleasing, then you are in a position to please the Father. Okay? So let me give you another definition. The word function is, you don't see it in Genesis 1:1, but the word that's under that word function is used 7 times in Genesis 1:1. And I mean, chapter 1, the whole chapter. And the Most High says, after he does something, goes, and it is good. Right? And then he says, and it is good. And he says, and it is good. 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. The 7th time he says, and it is very good. So every time he established something and gave it a function, not a form, he said it was good. So the function of that thing then is established forever. It never changes. So any arguments we have outside of that first chapter, when he establishes that everything is good, how he created it, how he made it function, is going to be false. So if later on you go, okay, he said this, animals eat this, you eat this, and you do this after its own kind. If you get 7,000 years later and somebody says, okay, now male can be with a male, I have to go back to where it was good. I can't go back into the middle. I can't go to Sodom and Gomorrah and say, see, they did it here.
Okay.
Right? Mm-hmm. I have to go back to wherever it was good. The idea of that comes from, and we would all understand it this way, when you are, if you've been to the mountains, when you get to the top of the mountain, they'll tell you if the water is raging, if it's moving, you can drink the water where it bubbles, where it, not bubbles, please don't drink bubbling water, but where there's where there's white caps, if you will, or where it's, you can drink that water because that water is fresh water. It's up here. But as you get further and further down a mountain and people begin to bathe in the water and dump their trash in the water, and you get all the way to the ocean, you can't drink this. Today I was boogie boarding and a wave hit me and water went down my nose and into my mouth. And I was like, oh, I'm going to die right now. This will be it for me. Why? This is no longer drinkable. But you could make the argument, right, that there is fresh water in there, so it should be, right? But nobody would drink it. So why do we do that with religious practice?
Right.
Where you'll say, well, this is how we do it now. But if a person tells you, okay, you learn this way as a Christian, but Christianity is a down the river, if you will, religion. They'll say it's Judeo-Christian, right? So it's a mixture of a mixture down the river, and it's now pretty much salted water. So what do we do then? We have to go back to first where it was good, and then purify the water through that filter. And once you get to the beginning, the water is then drinkable again. So when we're looking at scripture, and especially when we're dealing with Genesis and we're learning, you know, what we're supposed to be doing, male and female, people want to reject what happens in the first 3 chapters of Genesis because the fall happens. Yeah. But there's nowhere in scripture that it teaches, because there was the fall, that we now can use a different standard for righteousness. That's now dysfunctional. Just because somebody does something dysfunctional doesn't mean we keep doing something dysfunctional. That's most of the time the arguments we get from people in our families. This is how I've always done it. So you've adopted a form, right? And you've rejected the function. So when you say, I know you've always done it this way, but we do it all the time. That's why we get got with those infomercials. They'll find you a better way to chop something, toss salad, whatever it is. And we're like, oh yeah, that's better. This is the better. It's the better way to do something. And it's the purest way to do that thing. And it's the most functional way. We're always, as a people, whether we know it or not, we're always looking for a more functional way to do things. We buy wagons, we buy things for the kids. We're like, oh, that new thing is going to be the thing. Why? Because the human mind wants to do something the best way. But our rebellious nature, because we don't want to obey Yah, when it comes to his word, we want to do it the way that's easiest for us. And we've learned throughout time that it is very dysfunctional, and the fruit of it has been dysfunction, right? So just because it looks good and it feels good doesn't mean it's functional. Anybody have questions on form or function? Or if you have something that you may think is functional and it may just be form. I'll give the Hebrew word for functional. I said it in English, it was good, but it's tov. The Hebrew word for evil is ra. So, and ra means dysfunctional. Anything that is against the Most High's function is evil. Why? Because it's going to produce a contrary fruit. I'll give you another one that's form and not function in this walk, because it's not always about what people are doing outside of this walk. You can get in this walk and then become all form and no function. You can wrap your hair, you can put on fringes, you can keep the Shabbat, you can keep the dietary laws and be dysfunctional. Because you can get all the visual form together and be the most repulsive person to everybody outside. So I look like a Hebrew, but I don't have the mind, which is the heart, but the mind of Hamashiach. So I'm not winning anyone. To the Most High, that's dysfunctional. You can paint the outside. You can be a beautiful woman and be rebellious and wicked and unhospitable and all these things, and that's dysfunctional, right? Those are things in this walk that are also present, which force you to go back once again to the beginning and have to readjust that function. You can also be form and no function on this side as well. Questions, anything? Because now I'm on the hot seat. No questions? No, nothing. We're all too cold.
Could you go back? I pretty much got rid of everything that you said.
Uh-huh.
The part we was describing Eve,
Uh-huh.
that example. Can you go back to that?
With the idea of,
That there was something that wasn't.
oh, when he get, okay, so when he goes and if anybody has it, you could turn to it. When the serpent comes to her, he comes to her when he says, well, look at this thing. Isn't it good? And did the Most High say certainly that you're going to die? And he's pricking her form. Look at it. Now, once you look at it, you're like, well, it does look like every other tree out here. And well, it does. Like, and when she tried it, guess what? It tastes good, right? It's the same thing that we encounter, like now, with our food. If a person tells one of our children, hey, try this. Look, is it food? It tastes good. You put some barbecue sauce on it, put some hot sauce on the chitlins. They might, I'm just being serious. They're going to, but the reality is it functional? And what is it going to do to your body? So the adversary, and oftentimes he does that, he pricks our interest with how things present themselves, especially women. Like, is it shiny? Is it cute? Does it fit good? We go through all these functional outer things before we run it through, these form outer things before we run through the function of the thing. I bought a lot of things that were form and no function. I bought cars that were form and not very functional for me. When you look at that maintenance bill, you'd be like, I'm getting a Honda. I don't need this car. Why? Because it looks good and it has things, but it's not functional for me. And so oftentimes what happened really with Christianity was a form. What they did was what Constantine mainly, but the adversary did, was genius. I appealed to the form. I appealed to what people like to do for themselves. So they like to celebrate holidays. Different people all around the world have different gods, different religions. So the brilliance of what they did and the negative was they went to every culture and pretty much was like, oh, you know that Buddha that came? Well, that person that came, that's Christ. So you can keep, worshiping Buddha, but just know that Buddha is Christ. And then you go to all these different people, and so they're like, no, my God is God. And they say, like, we all believe in God, right? And you're like, no. Why? Because they've kept the form and no function. because the function, it doesn't work. Idolatry doesn't fit in there. But you can convince a person that they have the right God when they feel a certain way about what they're doing for their God. Okay. Anybody else? Anybody else? So now when you look at scripture and when you come across something, filter through that. Through the difference between form, how it looks, how it presents itself, how it feels, and what the function or how it was supposed to operate from the beginning. Yes. The first week, there was definitely a formative function, and it's funny because we were actually, I don't know who we were having a conversation with. The Most High does not think like we think. Remember, we're down the river. We're thinking with, you know how if somebody asks you something, like how they did, and I was like, what's a pencil? And they were like, it's something you write with. But had you not known that, you would have immediately went to, oh, it's yellow, and it has an eraser, and it has all these things. We think one way down the river, okay? So down the river, there are two warring thoughts right now, that a day begins on the fourth day, right? A day begins when the sun and the moon are established, right?
Yeah.
And then there's those people who just read it and say, day one is day one, and day two is day two, and day three is day three, and day four is literally day four. He doesn't say that at this time you have a clock, because remember, light existed before. So as soon as there was light, there was time. Now that goes into some quantum physics and some other things, but when light exists, time exists. Light is a determiner of time. The sun, the moon, the sun, the stars are for appointed times and for seasons. But time began at that moment. So day one is day one. Day two is day two. And if you go throughout history, I don't care how pagan the culture is, I don't care if you go to the Akkadians, the Ugaritic people, the Sumerian people, everybody kept a 7-day counting system. Nobody ever argued that there were 7 days in a week. It's never been an argument. Literally, we have so many arguments, and it's one of the few things that we actually argue about. We might argue how long a month is. We might argue when a day starts, but nobody has argued how long a week is. You can go back into antiquity. You can go back before there was, modern culture, and you will not get an argument for a week. Day one begins day one. That time system of counting sevens has been in existence, and there are observational evidences of that. One is literally the lunar cycle, where if you count 14 days, you're at a half moon, right? So those sevens are established. You get a quarter moon, you get a half moon, you get a waxing gibbous, and you're gonna get a full. You're gonna get all those things, and they're actually in pretty much patterns of sevens if you keep track of those. So what would have to happen in the beginning, if a day was not counted in sevens, is that you would have to keep adjusting and going back to that. Now I see where people have made that argument, trying to make it make sense. They're like, oh, if it's always on a Wednesday, then when you get to pretty much Passover is the one that really people lay heavy on, then you'll always get Passover. It'll always be in this particular pattern. But the genius of what happened during the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah is that in that year, at that time, it happened like that so that he could get up at that time. That's the genius. That was the artistry of the Most High. It could have happened at any other time, and it wouldn't have fallen like that, and he wouldn't have been the master of the Sabbath, and it was the perfection of time in that particular, at that appointed time, that made that way. It wasn't, we're not going to every year keep celebrating the feast day like it was during that time. Now, eventually it'll come around like that, and then you get Jubilee years and other things, but day one starts day one. When there's light, there's time.
Yep.
That makes sense. Anybody else? She said, how do we not count those days? How do we not? So what's interesting, and the calendar that the Most High set up, for the most part, was not one of these calendars that's like flowing into eternity, right? That's why in our culture, there are people who are called watchers. where they're supposed to watch the sun, the stars, the moon, the seasons for the appointed times, because they're all supposed to work in conjunction. One's not lesser than the other. The idea of lesser light doesn't mean like it's less important. It's just it's not as bright as the other light. Form, function. Form, it has nothing to do with that. So when you're dealing with a calendar, our people, interestingly, we're not so rigid like the westernized European culture. They didn't work on a tick, 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 tick. For instance, there's a verse and it's in Proverbs, and it's talking about the woman of folly, and she says, "My husband's gone, and he'll be back at the full moon." Right? If I tell you to meet me somewhere at the full moon, when you get there, it might be different from when I get there, but I'm not gonna leave. So I'm gonna wait. There's always that space and span of time where it's going to be different based upon where you're coming in from, and Hebraically we account for that. Just like we do it all the time. I'll be there at 6:30. I'd be like, I'm gonna at least wait till 8. Because why? It's kind of an unwritten thing. We were in Fiji, it's like almost 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and they had a thing called Senana Lanka. And I was like, what? And they're like, no time. I'm like, what do you mean no time? Like, we booked a tour, and it was only supposed to be 4 hours, and I'm still on this boat 6 hours later. Like, I had other stuff, and they're like, no, you do one thing a day. No time, no time. Why? Because the time of that rigid thing is not really a thing. Our people did watches. And the moon also operates in watches. It's not like count 31 days, count 30, count 31 days. Why? Because functionally, form-wise, it'll work to walk around with a pen and a piece of paper in the middle of nowhere. But remember, people have a pen and a piece of paper. So functionally, it wasn't, nobody was walking around like, no, they would look up and like, oh man, okay, I'm going to be gone until this time. And nobody was like, you were gone 7 days. More. No, it wouldn't have been like that, but you would be a few days in one way or another. And so when you're accounting for that in time, that's why months 365, and yeah, we calculated time. Why? Because then the calendar would get off. So like, oh man, okay, we can't be outside of a season, so how are we going to make up for this? It wasn't a big deal because they're agricultural. We have time as our time runs our lives because we work in these systems where it's like you're 9 to 5, you're 9 to 5, you're 9 to 5. If you're a farmer, the only thing that would matter was harvest. When is harvest? When are your seasons? Everything is seasonal. There's 2 harvest seasons within the Hebrew culture, and our 2 main feast days, Pesach and Sukkot, are surrounding those harvest seasons. So everything you planted would then be the determiner for what season you were in. You plant according to the season, you reap according to the season. Nobody was like, was it 73 days? We get those on the packets now. This thing will go into germination in 23 days. That didn't exist then. They're like, okay, I'm going to plant this time. The full moon's going to come. It helps pop the seeds during this time. And you watch everything is built around your environment. Another thing on form and function. Do I have a couple more minutes? When we think about a family, right? Most kids will draw a house, and they'll draw like a mom and a dad, a brother and sister, some grass in the front, the sun, and a dog, right? That's all the Hebrew was concerned with. How everything revolved around that system. In Genesis, you get that same picture. He made man, he made woman, he gave them grass, he gave them a place to live, he gave them something to cultivate and something to live around, and he gave them times when they would present themselves, pretty much appointed times, when they would present themselves to him. In Genesis, it's the Shabbat. Is the first thing we get, right? So they had this time where once a week they would come and they would commune with the Father. They weren't confused about it, and they weren't counting either. They were like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, it wasn't like that. It was all based around their daily work. They would be like, okay, I'm going to work for this amount of time, and then I'm going to rest. And the Father would come, and they would, because he came through like normal. When he came through and they were sitting, he's like, and he walked through in the cool of the day, like, where you at? Ready? It was functional. It was their system. And so any calendar or anything that puts you into this idea of all form, how it looks and how it feels, and no function, and it starts putting you at, you got Sukkot in December, it's not going to work. There's no harvest. There's nothing to bring to the feast day. There's nothing to put up booths with because nothing's growing around that time. Can't have Pesach in the summer because then there's no harvest. There's no first fruits. it would be burned up. If you've been to Israel, it's hot, like Fresno, Bakersfield, Lancaster. It's hot. The crop's not gonna make it. So you can't determine it based on where you sit. In California, yeah, every day could be Passover. Every day could be Sukkot. It doesn't work like that from that place. Israel is considered the belly button, that place, the belly button of the universe. It literally, if you take a map, you see I did like this, right? And you put it in the center, that place would be the center of the world. Time and everything is told from that place. So the best we can do in captivity is to try to get as close as, find some people that look like us and keep, time and figure out what they're doing, because a lot of them still live the same way. They still have sheep and they still have agriculture, and they keep their crops according to that way, because actually it's the law of the land. You have to let the land rest every so often. You have to do these things, and that's how that time is kept. Anything else? Yes.
I was trying to get an understanding on, were we supposed to actually keep the feast days when we since we're in the land of our captivity?
Yes. It's funny because we have the first Exodus and everybody focuses on that. There's also a second one coming. And the second one in scripture says it'll be greater than the first. So the function of the Exodus was a people in captivity who had to keep the Pesach at that time to get out of captivity. He says, when you come, I think it's Baruch 4 that I read when we were in London. He said, when you come to the knowledge of who you are in the land of your captivity, and you begin to obey and keep the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Most High, then I will come and get you. The beauty of it, or the sad part of it, I should say, is that we have to do it here, so you can't do it perfect. But it's not about perfect. In our culture, we know this. If your mom says, go in the cabinet and get me a bowl, and you were like, but there were 7 bowls, so I didn't get you none, you're getting a whooping. Right? So if try to think of, in a more cultural, functional sense, try to think of the Most High like that. I didn't do it because you wouldn't let me come home, so I'm just not going to do it at all. And he's like, oh, really? You're getting a whooping. You should have did the best you could, and that's what we're doing. We can't keep it perfectly, but remember, the first 439, if you will, 40 feasts in their completion were kept in the wilderness. They were kept outside of our land. Because why? The wilderness time is a time to perfect, to work out the kinks, so that when you come into the land, it'll be so much easier to just get in line. When he says, okay, yeah, you were doing this wrong, fix that. But if you had never done it and you didn't know what that was, how would you even be able to work out the kinks? I personally believe that people are like, when we get in the wilderness, this is the wilderness. You got out of captivity and still stayed within the territory of your land, your captors. Remember, from Egypt to Canaan, remember Rahab, they were all in these, to Canaan was still Egyptian territory. It was not until we fought for our land and subdued it that land switched over in our hands. Canaan was under Egyptian occupation. Look at your history. So you're still in the land of your captors. You're in your wilderness. You should be working out the kinks right now so that when you get into the kingdom, you can do it. I tell my Christian friends, I'm like, you're going to look at me and be like, okay, what do I do with this part of Sukkot? I'll be like, no, I'm not. You better bring the offering so you can get some rain. Yeah. But that's the thing. You're working out your kinks now. We're gathering. We're learning to live together in community. We're shedding those things amongst the other people. It happened to our ancestors in the book of Judges, I believe. Joshua Judges. Yeah. We're just like, where he says, I'm going to leave the Canaanites in the midst of you to prove you, to see if you're going to follow me. Where am I? Anybody know? Joshua Judges?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So it's the same thing now. I'm not going to take you out of captivity to make it easy for you. I'm going to leave you in the midst of people to see if you're going to follow me, even though you're in the midst of all this stuff. Yeah, it would be so much easier to just put you in a perfect situation. He did it with Adam, and it didn't work out too well. So now I'm going to leave you in this situation, and it's going to be a proving process. It's the passing under the rod. You make it out of this, you make it. You don't, you don't. Yes, Brandon. Brandon said it's the reason. It's kind of the reason why he leaves a thorn in our side. It's that thing that it's a constant reminder. One, that you're not home, because that's the whole purpose of the Feast of Tabernacles. You know that, right? It's a people, a displaced people. So you're keeping these feasts as a reminder. This is not my home. I'm sojourning. I'm tenting. I'm tabernacling here until a more perfect and established place is found. The feasts also have a function and a story in them. Everything he does is for function because he knows our nature as a people is to deviate and get that down the river attitude. He has to always bring us back. And how does he do it? In his feast days. It is appointed time so that you have to rethink and go through the process for your life. I think right now is a fruiting time. So you are, if we live in the country, so you can see the darnel wheat and the regular wheat when it comes up. And captivity is a humbling process. And those who are willing to be humbled now will not have to have proverbially when you come through the grain, the wheat that is real wheat, it bends down like this. The darnel wheat stands straight up. So you come through the sickle, you're gonna rip the heads off of all the ones that are still standing up. I'm trying to make what I'm gonna say more palatable. But all those who are willing to be humbled now don't have to worry about the sickle or the reaping of the other ones. Christianity has it backwards. It's not the good people that are taken away, it's the bad people. Go back and read it.
Right.
I think that's why it's so hard to tell our brothers and sisters this is the way we should be living. I mean, they're so indoctrinated. They don't even want to consider. They won't consider. They look at you like my mother said. These are fables. This is fantasy. And I'm like, are you going to say Bible? It's respectful, but it's amazing that you can talk and talk and talk.
We were talking about this not too long ago. Christianity has this wait till later, wait till later, wait till later. And the scripture teaches to do things now. When it's in your power to do good, do it now. When he knocks, answer. It's immediate. You do it right at the time when that thing comes and it presents itself to you. Christianity teaches of in this time, and when God comes and he's going to do this and so much in the future, live your life now. Why? Because the adversary prolong for destruction. It's the people that are doing now. You have to do it now. And that's just where we are. And so when you try to talk to people, they're like, oh, but God's going to fix me. He going to fix my diet when I get to heaven. I'm going to eat good when I get to heaven. I'm going to do whatever he say. No, you're not. If you won't do it now, why would you trust a person then? My mom wouldn't let people spend the night at my house who didn't obey their parents. Don't come over here and try to act like you wash dishes and you clean your room no. If you don't do it at home, don't come here and pretend. I think the Father has the same thing. If you can't do it and stand and be in front of the world and accept me and deal with the rejection, then I'm going to reject you. And so many people don't want to stand and deal with how people are going to think about them. Are you going to think I'm weird? So they reject him on this side, and so he's going to reject you on that side. Yeah. I see people I know. I see people I know.
All right, come on, y'all give Huldah a hand for that. Versus function. Okay. My camera's doing some weird things.
It's just reloading.
Okay.